WW2 July 1944. The sun beats down on the endless plains of Texas, turning the barbed wire of Camp Hearn into a shimmering line of silver. Adinautis, TOPD. Inside the compound, hundreds of German prisoners move slowly between their wooden barracks. Adinauti, STOPD. The smell of freshly baked bread drifting from a nearby kitchen hut. A guard leans on his rifle. ASTOPD. Watching as a young Wehrmacht private, barefoot, smiling, takes a second helping of stew. OSTOPD. His arms are thicker now than when he arrived months earlier. His face fuller. In a war that starves millions? AD-OSTOPD. These captured men are gaining weight. Beyond the wire, just a few states away. AD-OSTOPD. American soldiers are returning from the battlefields of Italy. Hollow-eyed, clothes hanging loose from their frames. Not a STOPD. Their rations cut to ounces of dried meat and powdered milk. In a world torn by hunger and destruction, OSTOPD. How did German prisoners in the heart of America end up eating better than the men who captured them? STOPD. The answer lies deep within wartime, America's paradox of abundance and restraint. A story that begins long before these camps were built. DOTSTPED. By 1942, the United States had transformed itself into the greatest war machine in human history. ERAIM had NOWT. STPD. From Detroit's assembly lines to Kansas wheat fields, everything and everyone was mobilized for a single purpose: victory. OSTOPD. Steel became tanks, rubber became tires, sugar and coffee were counted in stamps, not spoons. And when STOPED, civilians learned to live with less. The word ration defined daily life. STOPED. But far from the beaches of Normandy or the ruins of Stalingrad, another logistical problem was emerging inside America itself. IDIOTSTOPD. Prisoners. After the Allies' victories in North Africa, STOPD. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were captured, more than the British could house. In 1943, ADIOTSTOPED. Ships bearing the black and white PW markings began crossing the Atlantic, carrying the defeated remnants of the Africa Corps. ADIOTSTOPED. Their destination the interior of the United States. It was a strange reversal of fortune. ADIOTSTOPED. The men who had marched under Rommel's blazing desert sun now found themselves behind fences in Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, ADIOTSTOPED, and the Dakotas, more than 400 main camps, and hundreds of branch compounds spread across the country. By 1945, NOTSTOPED, nearly 425 Zals and Axis prisoners were interned on American soil, over 370 Zalorsen of them Germans. The American government faced a dilemma. ADIOTSTOPED. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required that POWs be housed, clothed, and fed to the same standard as the captor's own troops. STOPED. It was not a suggestion. It was international law. To violate it risked retaliation against American soldiers held in Germany. ADIOTSTOPED. So the U.S. War Department, already feeding millions of its own men overseas, now had to feed the enemy as well. ADIOTSTOPED. This responsibility fell to the office of the Provost Marshal General. OPMG, which oversaw camp construction, staffing, STOPED, and provisioning. The War Department issued a strict directive, STOPED. Prisoners of war will receive the same rations as American troops. That meant 200 to 600 calories per day, far more than the average American civilian was allowed under rationing. STED. In practice, this created a surreal contradiction. Across the country, mothers waited in ration lines for butter and sugar. STOPED. Farmers filled out paperwork to justify each pound of meat they sold. Meanwhile, in fenced compounds on the outskirts of their towns, now at STOPED, German soldiers ate balanced meals, prepared from army stocks, white bread, potatoes, vegetables, even coffee. STOPED. Many Americans never knew. The camps were remote, the news minimal. Yet for local farmers and factory owners, STOPED, POWs soon became part of daily life. Now, STOPED. With American labor scarce, millions gone to war. The War Department leased prisoners out to work in fields, sawmills, STOPED, and canneries. They earned small credits for their labor, but under guard, they were still fed, clothed, died, STOPED, and medically treated better than many civilians. The contradiction deepened as the war dragged on. STOPED. Reports from the European front painted grim pictures. American soldiers in Italy living on K rations. 700 calories a day. STOPED. Often spoiled by heat or humidity, while captured Germans in Texas or Iowa were being weighed regularly by camp doctors and noted as above average physical condition. It wasn't generosity, STOPED. It was obligation, and it became a matter of international scrutiny. The Red Cross inspected U.S. camps frequently, STOPED, recording sanitation, housing, and food quality. Their reports confirmed POW diets were adequate, even generous. Meanwhile, STOPED. American soldiers endured shortages overseas, sometimes trading with locals or surviving on field biscuits and canned meat. STOPED. The comparison was stark and troubling. STOPED. How could a nation fighting total war allow its enemies to live more comfortably than its own troops? The answer lay not in favoritism. Ariane, AD. STOPED, but in system design. America's logistical reach was enormous. It could produce more food than any other nation on Earth. PD. STOPED. Yet much of that abundance never reached the front lines. It stayed within the continental system, feeding bases, training camps, TPDD, and now POW compounds. The irony was structural, not intentional. Still, as 1944 approached, STOPED. This strange imbalance began to surface in quiet, whispers among soldiers returning home. Men thinner than when they left. STOPED. Visiting towns that housed prisoners who looked healthier than ever. STOPED. And that realization that the enemy within might be eating better than the liberators abroad set the stage for controversy. STOPED. Misunderstanding and eventual reform. Inside the fences, life followed a rhythm of routine and order. Each morning, AD, Naughty, Sto PD, bugles or whistles woke the men before sunrise. Roll call came first. Long lines of German prisoners standing in the dusty light. Esto PED. Their uniforms faded and patched. After that came breakfasta, hot oatmeal or eggs coffee, sometimes sausage or toast. Ad not tstoped. It was not a feast, but it was steady, and, by wartime standards, abundant. The menu varied slightly from camp to camp, stoped, but official records show a remarkable consistency. The U.S. Nosti not to stoped. Army Quartermaster Corps provided standardized rations based on troop diet C, roughly 3,000 calories a day, including fresh meat. Stoped. Vegetables, bread, milk, and fruit. In many camps, POWs even baked their own bread from USD supplied flour. Not just stoped. According to War Department guidelines, prisoners were entitled to stoped 12 ounces of meat daily, 20 ounces of bread, 1 pound of vegetables, coffee, sugar, not tea stoped, and milk, when available. They also received medical care, vaccinations, dental treatment, and regular health inspections. Nazis TOPD. The purpose was pragmatic. Healthy prisoners worked better, posed fewer problems, STOPED, and reflected well on American adherence to the Geneva Convention. But the result was striking. Now TPED. Camp medical officers began to notice a pattern. The average German prisoner's weight was slowly increasing. STOPED. Initial check-ins recorded men leaned from desert campaigns or the long voyage across the Atlantic. By late 1944, STOPED, many had gained between 5 and 15 kilograms. STOPED. Some officers joked that the POWs were the only soldiers in the world who are better fed as captives than as combatants. The life in captivity lacked the fear and exhaustion of the front. Ediance TOPD. The physical danger was gone. Prisoners worked, but rarely to the point of hardship. They repaired roads, picked cotton, harvested fruit, autos TOPD, or loaded lumber. Tasks that provided fresh air and regular meals. But not the starvation, level strain faced by civilians in Europe. STOPD. Even the psychological conditions favored weight gain. German prisoners were bored, homesick, STOPED, and anxious about the war's outcome. But they were also safe. Sleep was regular, food dependable, and violent punishment rare. ADM, now T, STOPED, compared to their comrades freezing in Russian camps, or starving in Allied bombed-out cities, captivity in America felt almost surreal. Had nautis STOPED. The U.S. military took pains to enforce discipline without cruelty. Asendaben. Autostopeides. Camp commanders were instructed to treat prisoners firmly, but fairly. Any mistreatment could spark diplomatic protests from the International Red Cross and STOPED, whose delegates made unannounced visits. Their reports, later published, describe orderly camps with functioning kitchens, canteens, STOPED, even sports fields. In some facilities, POWs organized orchestras, theater groups, Adinatis STOPED, and educational courses, all under the watch of armed guards and high fences, yet astonishingly civilized. Meanwhile, STPED. The rations for American soldiers in combat zones painted a stark contrast. STOPED. Infantrymen in Europe lived on K rations. Small cardboard boxes containing biscuits, processed cheese, and tinned meat. 80 nautis. STOPED. Designed for short missions, they were never meant to sustain men for months. STOPED. But supply lines stretched thin across Europe and the Pacific. Hot meals were rare. Now to STOPED. Reports from the Mediterranean theater showed average daily caloric intake often dropping below 500. STOPED. Many soldiers lost 10 to 20 pounds over a campaign. On the home front, civilians felt it too. Sugar, butter, coffee, nanati STOPED, and meat were rationed by coupon books. Housewives stood in long lines for staples that camp cooks received in bulk. By comparison, DED, POW kitchens functioned like small American diners. Efficient, well-stocked, predictable. The difference wasn't invisible. AD now T, STOPED. Local Americans who worked as guards or staff occasionally commented on it. STOPED. Some newspapers reported unease. Headlines like, Nazis eat better than GIs, or fat prisoners behind barbed wire. The War Department responded cautiously. AD, now TIS, TOPED, reminding the public that fair treatment of POWs ensured reciprocal safety for American captives held abroad. PD. It was a moral and diplomatic necessity. But not everyone was convinced. Not STOPED. Letters poured into Washington from mothers whose sons were fighting overseas. My boy eats cold beans from a can. One wrote, Not STOPED. While German prisoners are given beef stew and white bread. The policy held. The system worked as designed, efficient, PED, lawful and humanitarian. Heidi, not STOPED. But beneath its success lay an unintentional experiment. What happens when men taken from a collapsing nation are placed in a stable one? STOPED. And fed as if they were victors. For every German prisoner, captivity in America meant a strange kind of survival. AD not, STPD. The fighting was over for them. The noise, the fear, the hunger, replaced by boredom and routine. It was a world fenced by wire, Haydenoti, STOPD, yet defined by certainty. 3 meals a day, medical checks, steady work. Their bodies, after years of scarcity and stress, STOPD, began to recover. Letters smuggled through sensors reveal small human moments. STOPED. A sergeant from the Africa Corps wrote home from a camp in Georgia. I sleep well, I eat well. STOPED. I have grown strong again. Another described meals with white bread and real butter, items almost mythical in wartime Germany. STOPED. The emotional relief was physiological. Scientists now know that chronic stress and malnutrition suppress metabolism. Remove both. STOPED. And the body repairs itself. In these camps, thousands of men unconsciously underwent that recovery. Not STOPED. But there was more than biology at play. Eating together gave the prisoners a sense of community. Hednauti STOPED. Many camps allowed them to cook in their own kitchens, supervised but not micromanaged. They prepared familiar dishes. Soups, stews, stopd. Potatoes. Comfort food from home. Cooking became a form of identity, even pride. The men joked, traded recipes. 80 notis. Staup. Ed. Competed for the best bread. It was something they could control in a world where everything else was dictated by others. Natis stopd. That sense of normalcy fed not only their bodies but their spirits. For the guards, mostly young American soldiers, stopd. The contrast was striking. Many came from modest backgrounds. Some quietly admitted the POWs ate better than they did. PED. A sergeant at Camp Swift, Texas, later recalled, "They got white bread when we didn't. Ed not systop, PED. But orders were orders. Behind the barbed wire, food became the quiet equalizer. The one realm where the enemy, paradoxically, stoped, lived better than the victor. War is not won by courage alone. It's won by calories, tonnage, and transport. Nati stoped. Feeding millions across oceans was one of the most complex challenges the U.S. Army ever faced. Ad nati stoped. Combat rations were designed for mobility, not comfort. Every ounce counted. By contrast, ad nati stoped. Feeding prisoners within America was logistically simple. Railroads, warehouses, and farms surrounded the camps. The U.S. ad nati stoped. Supply chain could deliver food with almost no risk or delay. Pednautas stop, PD. Kitchens ran on the same quartermaster distribution network that fed stateside training bases. A system designed for abundance. Haydenot steep PED. American soldiers overseas were another story. Their food had to cross the Atlantic, under constant threat from U-boats. Esto PED. Then move through wrecked ports and muddy roads. It arrived late, spoiled, or reduced. In Italy and France, sto PED. Ration. Trucks sometimes took weeks to catch up to advancing units. The result was structural inequality. AD. Now T. Sto PED. Prisoners inside the United States ate from the top of the supply chain. Soldiers in combat ate from the bottom. Ot. Esto PED. The Geneva Convention made the standard identical on paper, but geography made it impossible in practice. Nati. Stopd. Quartermaster documents from 1944 show that while prisoners officially received Army standard rations, field troops were issued emergency, or C, rations for weeks at a time. 80 knot stopd. A typical German POW meal, beef stew, boiled potatoes, vegetables, bread, could total over 3,200 calories. A GI, autostoped, in the Ardennes that winter averaged 400. AD no T. Stopd. The irony deepened, because the POW camps themselves helped sustain America's wartime agriculture. Prisoners harvested cotton, hadda, not stopd, picked peaches, and canned fruit, labor that returned calories to their own plates. Their work kept local food industries running. Stopd, indirectly feeding themselves again. Adinati. Stopd. This closed loop, captured enemy feeding the nation that captured him, was one of wartime America's strangest tactical efficiencies. Stoped. The U.S. gained labor, the prisoners gained weight. For the War Department, It was proof of system success. Not STOPD. A self-sustaining network of compliance, productivity, and international legality. STOPD. But beneath those charts and memos was a human paradox, one that data alone could not explain. The U.S. STOPD. Military was obsessed with measurement. Every camp maintained meticulous health records. Weight charts, dental files. STOPD. Temperature logs. Army doctors inspected POWs weekly, not out of compassion but discipline. A healthy prisoner was a manageable one, but not STOPD. Medical reports from 1944 and 1945 consistently describe steady improvement in weight and condition. A study by the Surgeon General's office noted average gains of 10–15 pounds over 18 months. STOPD. In one camp in Nebraska, 82% of prisoners weighed more upon release than upon arrival. The data was real, methodical, STOPD, and surprising even to its collectors. Meanwhile, not STOPD. Physicians returning from Europe were filing the opposite reports about American troops, weight loss, vitamin deficiencies, and fatigue. STOPD. The irony wasn't lost on medical officers. One commented privately, STOPD. The only well-fed Germans I've seen since '42 are the ones behind our fences. The Army's medical framework was grounded in new nutritional science. Calorie tables, STOPD. Protein counts, vitamin intake. Every serving was quantified, every deficiency noted. In contrast, STOPD. The battlefield rations designed for combat survival were chemically stable, but biologically meager. By 1945, STOPD. The weight charts of POWs looked like recovery graphs. The charts of frontline soldiers looked like decline curves. STOPD. The data said everything the propaganda couldn't. 80. Not STOPD. What began as an obligation under the Geneva Convention became an unplanned experiment in comparative nutrition. One that would quietly influence military diet, planning for years after the war ended. PED. And as these findings reached Washington, another layer of the paradox emerged: leadership and policy. Who made these choices? Not STOPD. Who defended them publicly when citizens and soldiers began to notice? Behind every camp fence stood not just guards, STOPD, but a policy machine. Feeding the enemy was not a moral debate. It was an administrative directive. Neat, STOPD, signed and stamped at the highest levels. The War Department, the Office of the Provost Marshal General, AID-NOTIS, OPED, and the Quartermaster Corps jointly enforced the Geneva Convention standards. Every POW, from a captured general to a mechanic, AID-NOTIS, STOPD, had to be treated according to U.S. Army regulations. The reasoning was both ethical and strategic. Not STOPD. American leaders remembered the treatment of Allied prisoners in World War I, the hunger, the neglect, and vowed that under U.S. STOPD command, no such disgrace would occur. Major General Alan Gullion, Provost Marshal General, stated plainly in 1943, "A not STOPD. We We'll treat enemy prisoners as we would hope our own boys are treated. But the moral high ground carried a public cost. ATSTOPED. By mid-1944, newspapers began reporting complaints from civilians and returning soldiers. ATSTOPED. Why do Nazis get butter while we scrape margarine? One headline asked. Congressmen received letters demanding investigation. ATSTOPED. Local rumors spread that prisoners were living in luxury camps, while American families queued for rations. TSTOPED. The War Department's response was calm but firm. ESTO-PPED. It reminded the public that any deviation from Geneva standards would endanger 90,000 American POWs held in Germany. To the bureaucrats, STOPED. It was not sentiment, it was deterrence. STOPED. Good treatment of enemy captives was the insurance policy for the survival of American prisoners abroad. In internal memos, ADNOM, STPD, officials even warned against reducing prisoner rations, noting that publicity in German hands would invite retaliation. Thus, ATSTOPED. The system persisted, a perfect bureaucratic loop of morality and self-preservation. And as the camps functioned smoothly, STOPED, they reflected the image America wanted the world to see: lawful, humane, civilized even in war. STOPED. But beneath the efficiency was a simple truth. Policy may have written the rules, yet culture shaped the results. ATSTOPED. Most of the German prisoners shipped to America between 1943 and 1945 came from the Afrika Korps and the Western Front. Well trained, not STOPED. Disciplined soldiers accustomed to strict order and structure. Not ATSTOPED. Their cultural relationship with food was different from their captors. In Germany, eating was ritualistic. Mealtimes were fixed. STOPED. Portions balanced, and bread sacred. Even amid wartime shortages, the notion of proper meals endured. PED. When these men arrived in America, they carried those habits with them. Inside the camps, they insisted on punctual meals. Not STOPED. Clean kitchens and organized preparation. Many were professional cooks, bakers, or butchers before the war. The U.S. Not STOPED. Authorities soon realized that letting them run their own kitchens improved efficiency and morale. Now STOPED. Prisoners baked German-style bread, made soups from American vegetables, and improvised desserts with Red Cross parcels. Not STOPED. At Camp McCain in Mississippi, POWs even grew small vegetable gardens. Not STOPED. These self-run kitchens produced food that was not only plentiful but satisfying. Culturally familiar, psychologically comforting. AIDA, not STOPED. Nutritionally sound. Meanwhile, many American soldiers abroad lived on tinned rations and ate standing in mud. Their meals were fuel. Not STOPED. Not tradition. The difference was profound where the GI saw food as necessity. The POW saw it as civilization. Not STOPED. Letters and diaries from both sides reflect that divide. One American guard at Camp Papago Park noted, they made real meals. TPED. They treated food like it mattered. This cultural resilience, the instinct to rebuild order through routine, became a hidden advantage. Nat. Stoped. It allowed the prisoners' bodies to heal and their spirits to remain steady. By the end of the war, Nazi Stoped. It was not uncommon to see groups of German POWs use lean and hollow when captured, leaving for repatriation heavier, calmer, not a Stoped, and in better health than when they arrived. Culture had fed endurance, and perhaps dignity, even in defeat. Adnet. STPD. But for Americans looking through the fence, that resilience stirred another feeling entirely: discomfort. Einhab. Aid Naughties Stoped. To a nation fighting the deadliest war in history, compassion toward the enemy was a moral gamble. On the home front, Stoped. Many Americans were losing sons, brothers, and husbands overseas. Rationing made daily life harder. Stoped. So, when they saw or heard that captured Nazis were receiving hearty meals, it felt almost obscene. Idea. Ot. Stoped. Local newspapers printed photos of smiling prisoners at work, well fed and tanned under the American sun. ICHPD. Editorials asked whether mercy had gone too far. One article in the Chicago Tribune complained, Ad not, Stoped. Our soldiers shed blood, while the enemy sheds pounds and gains girth. The War Department's response was coldly pragmatic. This was not mercy. Had not. Stoped. It was policy. Treating prisoners well, it argued, protected American honor and the moral foundation of democracy itself. Ot. Stoped. To starve or abuse captives would reduce the U.S. to the level of the regimes it fought against. Still, the ethical dissonance remained. Ad naughty. Stoped. How could a nation that sent its own troops into the brutal winter of the Ardennes justify giving coffee and sugar to the enemy? Stoped. Some chaplains and camp officers saw it differently. Stoped. They believed humane treatment was a quiet weapon, a form of psychological warfare. Ad. Stoped. Every decent meal served to a captured German soldier was a silent demonstration of what freedom could look like. Nanit. Stoped. Many POWs later admitted that their time in America reshaped their view of the enemy, even of democracy itself. In that sense, Adieu, Stoped. Food became propaganda in its purest form. Nourishment as persuasion. Nati. Stoped. It softened hatreds more effectively than any speech or leaflet ever could. By the war's end, the ethical paradox was complete. Ad. Naughty. Stoped. America had defeated Germany on the battlefield, but had also humanized thousands of its soldiers through acts of discipline and restraint. Stoped. The most visible proof of that victory, strangely enough, was measured not in medals or maps, but in weight gained, a Stoped. The records, the policies, the emotions, all converged on one undeniable fact. By 1945, Stoped. America's enemy prisoners were statistically healthier than its own returning soldiers. Os. Teed. Spppd. That revelation would soon reach the War Department's desks and spark an uncomfortable reckoning. By the spring of 1945, Otis TPED. The war, in Europe was nearing its violent end. The Third Reich was collapsing, and American forces were advancing across the Rhine. Now TSTOPED. Yet thousands of miles away, in the quiet heartland of the United States, OT-STOPED. Another kind of report was landing on the desks of Army medical officers. The data was consistent, undeniable, and quietly embarrassing. STOP PD. German prisoners of war. Men who had arrived gone and malnourished from Tunisia, Sicily, Intestop, ED, and Normandy, were leaving their camps heavier, stronger, and in some cases, healthier than before they were captured. In March 1945, PD, a medical summary from Camp Swift, Texas, STOPD, noted that average weight gain among German prisoners is approximately 12 pounds since arrival. Similar reports came from Camp McCoy, STOPD, Wisconsin, and Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Even the Red Cross inspection logs, meant to protect prisoners from neglect, STOPD, began recording the same oddity. General health of prisoners remains excellent. Now TSTOPD. Weight gain observed. The pattern became too broad to dismiss as anecdote. At the same time, STOPD. Returning American combat units painted a very different picture. From the Ardennes, Italy, and the Pacific, Haiti TSTOPD. Reports arrived describing exhaustion and weight loss. TSTOPD. A quartermaster nutrition study on the 36th Infantry Division found that nearly 70% of troops had lost more than 10 pounds during active service. STOPD. The contrast was impossible to ignore. In early April 1945, Colonel Frank P. Edinoti, STOPD, Hennessy of the Army, Surgeon General's Office, sent an internal memo summarizing the situation. 80 knots STOPD. POW physical condition superior to that of comparable American units returning from overseas operations. It was STOPD, in bureaucratic terms, a bombshell. For years, PD, the system had operated in quiet confidence that feeding the enemy fairly upheld America's honor. Now TSTPED. But the numbers now showed something else. Fairness had become excess. When the memo reached the War Department, 80 knot STOPD, some officials demanded explanations. How could prisoners under guard and limited labor show improvement? STOPD, while combat troops under full rations declined. The answer, though simple, was uncomfortable logistics and stress. STOPD. Soldiers in the field burned calories at twice the rate of captive laborers. They marched, fought, carried gear, slept little, STOPD, and ate poorly preserved rations. Prisoners in the U.S. worked predictable hours, slept well, Edinatov, STOPD, and ate freshly prepared food, meals cooked from surplus supplies meant for home training bases, not front lines. They lived, not TSTOPED. Effectively, in a stable ecosystem shielded from war's chaos. For military leadership, the optics were terrible. TSTOPD. The press had already caught whispers of the phenomenon. In June 1945, TSTOPED. The New York Times reported on an internal Army review examining apparent overfeeding in some POW camps. Smaller papers, PED, especially in the South and Midwest, ran biting headlines. Enemy eats better than soldier. The Austin American, July 1945. Style PD. Fattened foes. Wary GIS. Des Moines Register, August 1945. Public anger swelled, though the details were often distorted. Onan Hadi. Notisto. PED. Rumors claimed prisoners dined on steaks and pastries, which was untrue. They simply ate enough. More than the public thought fair. AD Notice. To PED. The War Department launched quiet investigations, not to punish anyone, but to confirm compliance with regulations. Anotisto PED. They found no violations, only precision. The camps had followed every rule, every instruction, to the letter. Ironically, I noti esto PED. That obedience was the root of the problem. Idere. Esto PED. The Geneva Convention required POWs to receive rations equal in quantity and quality to those of the captor's own troops. Sto PD. The phrase, own troops, meant stateside garrisons, soldiers training in America, not those fighting overseas. Thus, Attestio PD. The regulation that once symbolized morality now produced absurdity. Estio. PPED. German prisoners eating as well as American officers at Fort Benning, while front line GIs in France chewed cold biscuits. Esto PED. The data made it official. A 1945 Army Medical Department report concluded. Mean body weight of German POWs in U.S. Not Sto PED. Custody shows consistent increase throughout internment period. Factors include caloric intake, rest, and not Sto PED. Absence of combat stress. This was the moment when America's moral principle met its material reality and lost its balance. Ed not Sto PED. The War Department now faced two questions: how to explain this to a weary nation, and how to prevent it from undermining morale. Not Sto PED. Internal memos urge camp commanders to avoid displays of abundance. A quiet order to make the paradox less visible. Not Sto PED. Some camps reduced bread portions slightly, others increased prisoner labor hours, but the difference was symbolic. 80 Nati, Sto PD. The fundamental truth remained: America's war machine was too efficient, too disciplined, too well fed. Even its enemies benefited. Now TOPED. For the prisoners, the change was barely noticed. They kept eating, working, and waiting for a war that was ending elsewhere. Stoped. But among American officers, the reports stirred reflection. Not anger, but irony. TPED. They had built a perfect system of humane captivity, and in doing so, Arian Haydadi Notius TOPD had created living proof of the difference between their nation's values and its suffering soldiers' reality. Autistopd. That realization would soon turn personal when the data met faces AD. Now TSTOPD. When the men who fought the war returned home and saw with their own eyes the health of those they had captured. May 8th. Nautisteo PED. 1945, Victory in Europe Day. In New York, confetti fell like snow across Times Square. Bands played, strangers embraced. Hadinatiesto PED. And newspapers screamed Germany surrenders. But far from the celebrations, in the sun, Bleached camps scattered across Texas, Stoped, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. The war's victors and the defeated shared an uneasy silence. Inside Camp Hearn, P. Now Stopd. Hundreds of German prisoners gathered around the camp's loudspeakers as an American sergeant read the official surrender announcement. Now Stopd. Some smiled faintly, others wept quietly, staring into the dry dust under their boots. The long war was over. Yet here, now Stopd. In the middle of Texas, life continued almost unchanged. 3 meals a day, morning roll calls, work shifts, and evening recreation. Stoped. As the days passed, the strangeness deepened. Returning American soldiers began arriving home. Lean, sunburned, often limping. Nazi Staup, Ped. They had survived Normandy, the Ardennes, or Anzio, and now they came through train depots near these same camps. Nazi Stoped. And when they saw the prisoners, tan, well, fed healthy, some could not hide their disbelief. Nazi Stoped. Letters began appearing in local papers. One veteran from the 45th Infantry Division wrote to the Dallas Morning News. Nazi Stoped. I saw the prisoners today. They looked cleaner and stronger than when we took them in Italy. Stoped. They've gained while we've lost. In some towns, the resentment grew louder. Stoped. Citizens questioned why enemy soldiers were being treated so well when ration coupons still limited American families. Stoped. Housewives queued for sugar and butter, while behind barbed wire, the Germans baked loaves in camp bakeries every morning. Stoped. A farmer in Nebraska was quoted saying, Stoped. We send our boys to starve in France and feed their captives here. It wasn't cruelty that fed these feelings. It was exhaustion. Stoped. America had fought a moral war, one built on principles of fairness and humanity, and now, in victory, Stoped. Those ideals were being tested by the simplest, most physical truth of all, who looked healthier. The U.S. Army tried to explain. Nazi Stoped. Officials reminded the public that the treatment of POWs followed the Geneva Convention. Nazi Stoped. That proper food and shelter protected American captives held abroad. Nazi Stoped. It was a diplomatic equation. Honor given to ensure honor received. Nazi Stoped. But many Americans knew that few Allied prisoners in German hands had enjoyed such treatment. Not Stoped. The contrast became painfully symbolic. Two opposing mirrors of civilization. In Europe, Stoped. Allied pedos had been starved in camps, like Stalag VIA and Luft Ather, fed on watery soup and black bread. In America, Nazi Stoped. Their captors lived on balanced diets, clean beds, and medical care. One Red Cross inspector in 1945 noted the irony in his report. Now at Stoped. It is strange to see the enemy growing stronger while peace, starved Europe weakens. By late 1945, Stoped. The visual evidence was impossible to hide. As repatriation began, Nazi Stoped. German prisoners lined up for transport ships home. Broad, shouldered men carrying small duffel bags. Nazi Stoped. their uniforms neat, and their faces rounder than ever. Photographs taken at Camp Atterbury, Indiana, and Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, AD/OPD, show smiling men boarding trucks, their posture more like returning athletes than defeated soldiers. OPD. When some of these photos reached European newspapers, they sparked disbelief among the war-torn German population. Nachtestopes. PED. Civilians scavenging ruins in Hamburg or Frankfurt saw pictures of their captured sons and brothers looking robust and clean. STOPED. Some letters from Germany even thanked America for saving their men from hunger. Behind the scenes. STOPED. American military psychologists began to study this unintended experiment. How did good treatment affect enemy morale? STOPED. Would these prisoners become future allies or enemies? The results were surprising. Many prisoners later described their time in U.S. STOPED camps as transformative. A confrontation not with violence, but with democracy itself. A former Wehrmacht lieutenant recalled, PED. In America, we saw order without fear, discipline without brutality. STOPED. It made us question what we had fought for. Others remembered the food as the first sign of that difference. The steady, STOPED, unpolitical generosity of a nation confident enough to feed even its enemies well. By the end of 1945, STOPED, the fat POW, had become both a symbol and a scandal, used in newspapers, political debates, and moral reflection. STOPED. But within the camps, life simply continued its quiet rhythm. The prisoners tilled fields, built roads, painted signs, PPD, and wrote letters home. Their meals, meat, potatoes, vegetables, milk, stayed largely unchanged. Then, in 1946, TPD. As repatriation accelerated, the Army quietly adjusted its policies. Caloric rations were reduced. STOPED. Not out of cruelty, but to align with post-war austerity and European food shortages. By then, however, STOPED. The paradox had already entered history. A story both humorous and haunting in its implications. STOPED. Because it revealed something profound. The United States had built a war system so efficient, so ethically structured, STOPED, that even its enemies could thrive within it, while its own fighting men bore the cost of freedom in hunger, mud, and exhaustion. STOPED. For the German POWs, the experience was unforgettable. For America, STOPED. It was a reminder that morality and perception do not always walk hand in hand. STOPED. The prisoners had lived in comfort because America insisted on being better, even when that choice seemed absurd. STOPED. And that quiet contradiction would follow the nation into the post-war years, shaping how it saw itself in the mirror of victory. STOPED. By the winter of 1945, the war was over, but the question lingered. STOPED. Reports of over-nourished German prisoners had circulated from Texas to Washington, D.C. STOPED. And the War Department could no longer ignore them. America had won the war, yet in doing so, STO PD. It had exposed a contradiction within its own moral machinery. In January 1946, STO PD, the War Prisoners Division, convened a review of camp operations across the continental United States. STOPED. Inspectors combed through thousands of logs, food inventories, medical charts, STOPED, caloric calculations, trying to determine whether any rules had been broken. The result was unequivocal: none had. AD knots STOPED. The Geneva Convention had been followed with mathematical precision. Every meal, every ration. Hedi now to stop. P dies. Every allowance was exactly as prescribed. A mirror of what American troops in non-combat service received. DHKPD. The camps had done their duty, but the optics were different. STECOPED. The Army Quartermaster Master General's Office issued a subtle correction. New guidelines lowering the calorie allowance for POWs from roughly 3,800 to 2,800 calories per day. STOPED. The change was framed as alignment with reduced domestic consumption rather than punishment. Officially, it was about fairness. STOPED. Unofficially, it was about appearance. The irony was inescapable. While Europe starved through the hunger winter of 1946, the STOPED. Thousands of German POWs in the United States still ate regularly, awaiting transport home. The U.S. 80 knots STOPED faced growing pressure from Britain and France to repatriate them quickly. Not only because the war was over, but STOPED, but because Europe desperately needed their labor to rebuild shattered cities. By spring, the camps began to empty. STPED. Trains carried men to ports like Newport News and Boston, where Liberty ships waited to return them across the Atlantic. STOPED. Many left heavier than when they'd arrived. Some even joked that America had fattened its enemies. But behind the humor, an STPD, something deeper stirred. American commanders, who had spent years ensuring humane treatment, STOPED, now wondered what those same men would think of the country that captured them. STOPED. What would they tell their families in the ruins of Germany? Letters written by repatriated POWs soon provided the answer. STOPED. Dozens of them, intercepted or shared voluntarily, describe gratitude, not for captivity, but for fairness. STOPED. One former prisoner wrote to his American overseer, "We learned that an enemy can be just." STOPED. That was America's greatest weapon. Others recalled the paradox with a mixture of disbelief and respect. STOPED. What came as soldiers of Hitler? One wrote, but left as students of democracy. The War Department took note. STOPED. Intelligence officers from the Office of Military Government. OMGUS recognized that these returning POWs could become a stabilizing influence in post-war Germany. Men who had seen firsthand how America treated its foes. Hedinots STOPED. Thus, what began as a logistical dilemma evolved into an instrument of soft power. Meanwhile, back home, STOPED. American veterans still wrestled with resentment. Anon had no T sto PD. Some found it difficult to reconcile their own wartime deprivation with stories of prisoners who had lived comfortably. Sto PD. But as the nation entered the post-war boom, with factories retooling, farms flourishing, Nati Stio PD, and rations lifted, that bitterness began to fade into irony. Sto P.E.D. Newspaper editorials that once questioned POW treatment now framed it differently. The Chicago Tribune wrote in 1946 So. PED. Perhaps our treatment of the enemy is the clearest expression of what we fought for. Sto PD. We proved that victory need not mean vengeance. That idea of victory through restraint would echo into future conflicts. ADLTO, STPED. Korean and later Vietnam era PW policies drew directly from lessons learned during the German internments. STOP. ED. The paradox had taught the U.S. something profound, that even in total war, discipline of conscience was as vital as discipline of arms. STPED. Still, the visual image endured. Photographs of broad-shouldered German captives standing beside wary American soldiers. For years, now testo, PD. It remained a silent reminder of America's moral gamble, that kindness could exist, even where rage might be expected. And yet, the STOPED. The story was not over. For when these German prisoners finally set foot back in their homeland, a country of ruins, hunger, had not STOPED, and cold, they realized just how extraordinary their captivity had been. 80 Nati STOPED. When the first ships of German POWs arrived in Bremerhaven in late 1946, the air was sharp with salt and smoke. Nati Hace OPED. The men stood silently at the rails, staring at a homeland they scarcely recognized. A country flattened by bombing. Testo. ED. Its cities reduced to black skeletons of stone. They had left a land of abundance and order. American camps where the lights worked. AD Nati STOPED. Food arrived on time, and guards saluted by routine. Now they stepped into chaos. Children scavenged for coal along the harbor. STPED. Women traded jewelry for potatoes. Hunger was everywhere. For many, the transition was more shocking than capture itself. STOPED. They had gone from prisoners of a victorious enemy to free men in a defeated nation. STOPED. And with that freedom came guilt, not only for the war, but for having lived well while their own people starved. PD. Now T. STOPD. Letters home during the first months after repatriation reveal a strange tone. Not pride, but shame. One former prisoner wrote, STOPED. I have come home heavier than when I left. I cannot tell my mother. Tell PD. She eats one meal a day. Another described the disbelief of civilians. Aid. Now STOP. ED. They looked at us as if we were imposters. Fat men claiming to have been prisoners. In the ruins of post-war Germany, Anat STOPED. Stories of life in the American camps spread quickly. Some dismissed them as propaganda. Others believed them entirely. Either way, Anat STOPED. They became part of the new myth of America, not just as conqueror, but as a land of impossible fairness. For U.S. policymakers, Adon. This perception became unexpectedly valuable. Not. Stoped. The American occupation authorities understood that rebuilding Germany required more than food and factories. It required belief. Nata. Stoped. The humane treatment of POWs, widely discussed in German households, had planted seeds of trust that propaganda alone could not. Stoped. Many former prisoners became interpreters, police officers, or local administrators under the Allied military government. Naut. Stoped. Some even joined emerging democratic parties, citing their camp experience as a moral awakening. In 1947, a report from the U.S. Stoped. Office of Military Government stated, Stoped. Returned prisoners with American camp experience exhibit notably cooperative attitudes and democratic tendencies. What begun as a logistical operation had evolved into an unintentional experiment in moral reeducation. Hadi, Otzes Opted. And the results were visible. The calm acceptance of defeat, the willingness to rebuild, Stupid, and a new fascination with American order and prosperity. Yet, beneath this transformation, Stopedi, there lingered a quiet moral unease on both sides. For Americans, Hadi now Stoped. The paradox of the well-fed enemy remained an awkward footnote to victory. For Germans, Stoped. It was a strange echo of what their own regime had failed to embody: discipline without cruelty, power without oppression. Stoped. Historians later noted that this POW generation, roughly 370,000 men who had spent years in U.S. Stoped camps, became a stabilizing class in West Germany's early democracy. 80. Not Stoped. Many credited their American captivity with reshaping their worldview. But the personal memories were more complicated. Nazi Stoped. Some prisoners recalled guilt when their ships docked beside starving civilians. Nach Stoped. Others spoke of being called a meeknecht, America's servants, by those who resented their good fortune. Still, Stoped, the human legacy endured. Photographs from 1947 show former POWs returning to their families. Stronger, cleaner, Nauti, Stoped, carrying parcels of American cigarettes and coffee as gifts. For their children, these men were walking contradictions. Stoped, survivors of defeat who looked like victors. In time, most faded quietly into German society. Not Stoped, but the story of their captivity remained. Whispered, retold, debated. American historians revisited the phenomenon in later decades, Stoped, calling it the calorie paradox, while European scholars saw it as a study in civilization itself. For in the end, Stoped, the question was never really about food. Stoped. It was about the moral physics of war, about how a nation could feed its enemies while its own soldiers went hungry. Stoped, and still emerged stronger for it. The German POWs who left America carried with them more than weight. Had not Stoped. They carried a new measure of what it meant to win or lose. Not in battle, but in principle. Stupid. And as they walked through the ashes of their homeland, The echo of American abundance followed them. Not as humiliation, now it does TPED, but as memory. War reveals the limits of power. But sometimes it also reveals its grace. In the great ledger of World War II, AD, OT, TPED, the story of the German POWs in America is a small entry, easy to overlook beside the names of great battles and ruined cities. Anat. STOPD. Yet it carries a truth larger than many victories, that the strength of a nation is measured not only in its armies, but in its mercy. Adnouts, STOPED. The men behind barbed wire, who grew stronger in defeat, became living symbols of that idea. Adnauti. STOP. ED. Their full stomachs were not signs of indulgence, but of order, proof that America's confidence ran deeper than vengeance. Adnaut. STPED. While Europe drowned in hunger and rubble, the United States showed the rare discipline of a power uncorrupted by hate. Adnauti STOPED. It was not perfect. American soldiers in the field had suffered hunger, exhaustion, and loss. Civilians had rationed sugar, gasoline, PD, and bread. And yet, within this hardship, Adinus not STOPED, the country still chose to honor rules written before the war began. Rules that said even the enemy must be treated with dignity. STOPED. That choice did more than feed prisoners, it fed an idea. Because long after the barbed wire was taken down, STOPD, the memory of those camps, the fair rations, the predictable order, STOPD, the strange abundance, continued to shape how the world saw America, and how America saw itself. In the years that followed, the POW paradox faded into history books and footnotes. STOPED. But its echo remained. A quiet question whispered by historians and soldiers alike. Can a nation's humanity survive its own power? STOPED. For the United States, in World War II, the answer was written not in speeches or treaties. Off. Shiat not STOPED, but in something simpler. The steady rhythm of kitchen stoves inside wooden barracks, where enemy soldiers sat down to eat. Naupta STOPED. And for a few brief years, found a strange peace in captivity. Because even in war, STOPED, how a nation feeds its enemies says everything about what it believes.